Well, it is almost fall, and that means that it's time to start breaking out some of our favorite fall recipes here on our homestead. And so today I'm going to be sharing with you tips for how to make the best stew, whether it's beef or venison ever, as well as my recipe for venison stew, which is also my recipe for beef stew. Well, if this is your first time here, my name is Brianna, and my husband Gray and I like to learn, practice, and teach our children traditional skills. Yes, it is currently the middle of September and fall is quickly approaching. This was the first morning that it felt like fall, and so I'm going to be making my rustic venison stew. This recipe also works well with beef, so wherever you see venison, you can treat beef exactly the same way. I'm going to be using venison chops today because that's what I have, but you could use venison steaks or venison stew meat or whatever you have. So during the fall and winter months, stew is a regular guest to our kitchen, either beef stew, lamb stew, or venison stew. And I just find that it's a very cozy and hearty and savory dish that I can make ahead of time, and it fills the whole family. It uses a lot of our storage crops that we grew throughout the summer, and we usually keep our freezer stocked with home-raised chicken and turkey and home-raised lamb, as well as locally sourced beef and game that Gray has caught. And so we do eat venison. He usually goes hunting every year. The meat that I will be using is from 2 years ago's season, and so I really want to get that in the rotation to make room in our freezers. Now, I've talked about the importance of having a freezer on a homestead and how useful it is just to extend your pantry and save money and time, and I will leave the link for that video down in the description box below. Keep in mind that I'm going to be moving pretty quickly and just showing you the process of how to make this venison stew, but if you want the full recipe, I will leave a link to the corresponding blog post in the description box below. So the first thing that you're going to do is cut up your steaks. If you're not using pre-cut stew meat from the butcher, cut it up into about 1-inch cubes. I like to make my spice mixture in a gallon freezer bag. This recipe uses a lot of bold flavors and spices, very similar to like a Cajun seasoning, but I make it myself. And so get a gallon-sized Ziploc bag and put in all of your spices. After your meat has been cut, put in all of your spices and flour. Drop your pre-cut venison or beef, if you're using, into the gallon-sized freezer bag, and then seal and shake the seasonings to really coat the meat in the spices and the flour mixture. The spices that I personally like to use in this recipe are paprika, salt, garlic powder, black pepper, onion powder, dried cayenne pepper, dried oregano, and dried thyme leaves. And again, I add a little flour to the bag because that helps the meat brown up nicely. In a large pot or a Dutch oven, heat a tablespoon of butter in the bottom of the pan. When the butter is hot and you can touch a piece of meat to the bottom of the pan and it sizzles, you know it's ready. I brown the venison in batches, so I take about half the meat that I'm using and make sure each piece has enough space in the bottom of the pan. If you crowd the meat, it tends to just steam instead of brown. Once the venison is browned, put it in a bowl and then do your next batch. When all the meat is browned, deglaze the pan with red wine or a bit of beef broth. Scrape the bottom of the pan to release all of the bits that are left from browning the meat. Take this mixture that you've just created in the bottom of the pan and dump it over the bowl that your browned venison is in. Heat 1 tablespoon of olive oil to your now deglazed pot and add the onions, the celery, the carrot, and the garlic. Once your vegetables are soft and fragrant, add the venison back to the pot. At the same time, add your can of tomatoes. I'm using a jar of our home canned tomatoes here, and I have a video on how I do this. I will leave linked in the description box below. So at the same time, add the tomatoes, the fresh basil, the fresh thyme, the bay leaf, the tomato paste to the beef broth, and if you're using your greens, you can add your greens. Once the stew is brought to a boil, lower the heat to low and let it simmer for about 30 minutes. After your stew has been simmering for 30 minutes, it's time to taste test. If your stew at this point needs more salt or more pepper or more of anything, now is the time to add it. We love to serve this hearty venison stew with artisan bread toasted with butter, and it is a very filling and delicious fall meal. Now on to the tips to make any stew that you're making, whether beef, lamb, venison, the best stew. And so my first tip is to let the meat come to room temperature before you brown it. So I will oftentimes, about an hour before it's time to cook, set my meat on the counter, and that lets it come to room temp. Because we use the spice bag in this recipe, you could either do this in the spice bag, just let it sit there before you brown it, or just as you're defrosting the meat, let it sit on the counter before you add the spices. The next tip is to dry the meat before you add it to the spice bag. This helps the meat brown a lot better. I mentioned this before, but when you're browning the meat, make sure to not crowd it. If it's crowded, it just steams instead of browning. The key to any stew is low and slow. So 30 minutes is the bare minimum. This stew can be cooked for longer as long as it is extremely low. It can even be put into the crock pot. I would still brown the meat, but after that, everything can pretty much go into the crock pot. The next tip is to use a good quality beef broth. Not all beef broths are the same, and so find one that has good ingredients, because even though the meat is the star of the show, the broth of any soup is really the second best. And so make sure the broth that you're using is a good quality and savory broth. And finally, this makes a wonderful freezer meal. This is one of the meals that I will double and make 2 batches of, so I could put one in the freezer. Well, if you try this recipe, I would love to hear about it. You can tag me on Instagram or leave a comment down below. Thank you so much for being here, and I will see you next time.